Welcome to Ruins and Haunting Heritage. My name is Dr. April Bisa. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Vassar College, and this is my archaeology seminar for the fall 2020 semester. Cheesy suspense music is perfect for today's topic. We are going to be going over some of the first sections of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. Fun fact for you is that a recent movie, Shirley is the title, that is about the life of Shirley Jackson, or a small segment of her life, was partially filmed on the Vassar College campus using people from Vassar in all aspects of the production. And some of the lecture hall scenes were shot in Blodgett Hall, which is the building that houses the Vassar Anthropology Department. So we have a very good connection to Shirley Jackson and her book here. So I'm just going to kind of whet your appetite and give you a sense of what, as an archaeologist, you might be reading into this book. And then we're going to just expect you to be reading this book, and we will get to a day later in the semester where we essentially have a book club and we talk about the book in detail. But to get you started, I'm using the edition that is the Penguin Classics edition with an introduction by Laura Miller. And this introduction is good for setting up what's going on, but it's better if you have already read the book or maybe seen one of the many movie adaptations, several of which are not true to the story, or the recent TV series, which I actually have not seen, which I'm sure is not 100% accurate to the story. It doesn't really give anything away, but it talks about the characters in the introduction by Laura Miller that might not resonate as much. So maybe read the first couple of sections. They're not really chapters, but they have numbers, but the numbers restart over again. And then go back and read that introduction. But some of the things that Laura Miller talks about in the introduction that I want you to be paying attention to and look for is that one of the things about ghost stories is that they often have traps for the protagonist. And the protagonist is often a scholar, especially somebody who is a collector or an antiquarian. That puts them in contact with things that are old and therefore things that have histories and stories to generate that hauntedness. So this is why archaeologists are often part of ghost stories. So you need somebody who is skilled in investigation, often who found something old or found an old place, but also somebody who easily succumbs to curiosity and has a propensity for meddling in the past. Those are Laura Miller's words. So it falls within the stereotype, the Indiana Jones stereotype of an archaeologist, is that, you just can't help yourself and you get involved in things that you probably shouldn't be involved in because you're in the middle of somebody else's history. So later on, we will read and talk about some work by Gabe Moshenska on the archaeology and uncanniness, especially with the ghost stories of M.R. James. So Hill House has also a trap for the reader, that the archaeologist is the protagonist in that Dr. Montague gets everybody together, and it's because of him that the main character, Eleanor, has come to Hill House. But Eleanor turns out to be the actual protagonist, but she's also not typical of protagonists in ghost stories, which is part of the fun of this story, that it goes in directions that aren't the ones that you already could kind of predict where it's going to go. So the book is written from the perspective of Eleanor, this young woman who has just come to Hill House on invitation because she may or may not have some sort of supernatural abilities. And we experience the house through her. So Laura Miller says that the literary effect we call horror turns on the dissolution of the boundaries between the living and the dead, of course, but also at the crudest level between the outside of the body and anything that ought to stay inside. So one of the aspects of haunted heritage is that these are stories that aren't told in the general public or in history books for some reason usually. And sometimes when we as archaeologists or as investigators uncover something that has been forgotten, we are meddling and we are possibly exposing something that should have stayed hidden if your goal is to keep people feeling safe, comfy, and happy with their Mickey Mouse versions of what the past was. So throughout this book, we're trying to figure out what this haunting is in the same way that an archaeologist tries to figure out what a site is or what an archaeologist is. And throughout the story, Eleanor, the main character, according to Laura Miller, is drifting in and out of a dream state even before she arrives at Hill House, endlessly taking apart and reassembling bits of fantasy and experience to fashion the imagined life she hopes eventually to live. What she is headed towards is not delusion, but a collision with absolute reality. So for this reason, with Eleanor's kind of trajectory, that she's not sure where she's trying to go, but she's trying to go somewhere, I think makes this a good book for college students who are also on their own path of discovery. So my last quote from Laura Miller is that she says, "What we really fear is ourselves, or seeing ourselves clearly, or knowing what we really want." Right? So this, who are we afraid of? What are we afraid of? Maybe we're afraid of ourselves, really helps us to understand what Eleanor is going to be going through. It also links to the concept of mirrors in ghost stories. If you know the Candyman story that was recently remade into a new movie, you look in the mirror and you say Candyman's name 3 times and he appears. So looking at yourself and being sure about what you're doing is something. When in a lot of ghost stories, you look in the mirror, you see somebody else. It's not you. Or if it's like a vampire story, you look in the mirror and you don't see who you think you see in real life, right? So horror is somewhat about this reflection of what is real, what is fake, who am I, and what should I really be worried about or concerned about in life. So that's enough for the introduction. So now we're going to actually get into Shirley Jackson's words here. Chapter 1, Part 1, Hill House. Hill House is set alone against the hills, 80 years old and closed up, but in good condition. So remember, Shirley writes this book in 1956. So in 1956, minus 80 years, where are you? You're at the Civil War, right? So you're at this like new creation of America. So 80 years is not that old. So since 1956 is about 80 years old from now. So Hill House at this point would be 160 years old. We meet Dr. John Montague, a PhD in anthropology, because he chose that because he wanted to study supernatural manifestations and the causes and effects of psychic disturbances or hauntings, but he wanted to have some sort of real training and real title. And Dr. Montague had been looking for an honestly haunted house his whole life. some of you have probably been looking for an honestly haunted house your whole life. And that's a lot of what these ghost hunter TV shows are, is that people are in search of definitive proof one way or another, but they're enjoying the ride along there. So it's not disappointing when you don't find a truly honestly haunted house, because there's always enough anywhere to make you think, well, the next one is going to be the honestly, truly haunted house with no questions asked. So Dr. Montague rents Hill House for 3 months, and he is using the methods of the 19th century ghost hunters that you could read more about in Roger Clark's Ghosts and Natural History book. So how we search for ghosts has changed over time, and it mirrors how science has changed over time. So in this book, people are just going to see what they could feel and experience and talk about it. And that's a lot of what science was in the distant past. And then in the more recent past, you get this sense that you need to be able to document things with meters and film and photographs, and that changed haunting research since then. But in this book, they're just using your own natural senses with nothing enhanced. But Montague did pull together people that he thought were better at detecting or manifesting hauntings than others. It says, Shirley says, painstaking documentation of phenomenon had largely gone out as a means of determining actuality, right? But now it's come back again with the use of EMF detectors and such. His assistants that he brings to the house are people who had been involved in abnormal events, and they're invited to stay for the summer to observe and explore, including the stories that had been told. He sends 12 letters to 12 different people, and only 4 people reply. So it isn't that there's this big reward money that is being offered in the movie adaptations of similar stories. It is just, hey, I'm offering for you to come stay at a truly haunted house and experience it and discuss it with other people. So part 1, chapter 2, we meet Eleanor Vance, who's 32 years old. She has no friends and she hates her family. Shirley says she could not remember ever being truly happy in her adult life. And the reason that Dr. Montague picks her is she was involved in an event where stones rained down on the family home. Also part of the group is Theo, or Theodora, who will be the only other female in the story, but is therefore spends a lot of time with Eleanor. And Theo's there because she has the ability to identify cards. So, what card am I holding in my hand? That's a Jack of Spades, right? So that's not the most impressive supernatural ability, but, maybe somebody in the class has that ability. There's also Luke Sanderson, the nephew of the Hill House owner, who is described as a liar and thief who cheats at cards, right? So we have this, is Theo cheating at cards to be able to identify them? How is she different from Luke? But Luke is a liar and a thief, but Theo is maybe supernaturally inclined. So going into chapter 3, there's some other people, but they don't fall out as being super important to the story. I think part 1, chapter 3 is important because in here we have a little old lady that damns Eleanor over and over, and then leaves with, "I'll be praying for you, dearie." So we're setting up this kind of suspense that Eleanor is both damned and somebody to be prayed for. We now move into chapter 4 of part 1. And Eleanor is driving to Hill House. And she has been told that it is inadvisable to stop in Hillsdale, the town where Hill House is located. Of course, it's up on the hill of Hillsdale. And she has been told that the people there are rude to strangers and openly hostile to anyone inquiring about the house. So on her drive there, we have a bit of setting the tone as to exactly who Eleanor is. But this passage is both one of the most beautiful passages I've ever read, but it's also, I feel that way because I think it's very archaeological in how it looks at the landscape and sees more in the landscape than just a space to move past. So I'm going to read this, and I'm going to try to read it without messing up or being overly dramatic, but keep in mind I really, really like this passage. She had never driven far alone before. The notion of dividing her lovely journey into miles and hours was silly. She saw it, bringing her car with precision between the line on the road and the line of trees beside the road, as a passage of moments, each one new, carrying her along with them, taking her down a path of incredible novelty to a new place. The journey itself was her positive action, her destination vague, unimagined, perhaps non-existent. She meant to savor each turn of her traveling, loving the road and the trees and the houses and the small ugly towns, teasing herself with the notion that she might take it into her head to stop just anywhere and never leave again. She might pull her car to the side of the highway, although that was not allowed, she told herself. She would be punished if she really did, and leave it behind while she wandered off past the trees into the soft, welcoming country beyond. She might wander till she was exhausted, chasing butterflies or following a scream, and then come at nightfall to the hut of some poor woodcutter who would offer her shelter. She might make her home forever in East Barrington or Desmond or the incorporated village of Burke. She might never leave the road at all, but just hurry on until the wheels of the car were worn to nothing and she had come to the end of the world. What makes that very archaeological for me is that the descriptions of each place are of the kinds of descriptions that archaeologists write down, right? It's something that seems relatively normal, average, every day to lots of people. A road, a line of trees. Archaeologists document these things because it's part of understanding the place and the experiences there. But it's also that in archaeology, even the ugly bits are part of the important story. The little pieces of chipped stone, the little pebbles that are a different color, the soil that's a different color. Everything together brings this sense of what that place was, what it meant to people, and the possibilities that were there that may or may not still be there. And if they're not still there, why are they not still there? So experiencing a place in depth, really getting to experience it, I think is an important part of archaeology. When you go to an archaeological site, especially if you live there while you dig there, you really get to know a place. And at that point, that place is all that matters. So Eleanor has all these reasons to stop at all these places that are beautiful and are calling to her. But she continues on to the Hill House instead, even though she's been warned of what she will find there. At one spot, she stopped altogether beside the road to stare in disbelief and wonder. The gateway was no more than a pair of ruined stone pillars, with a road leading away between them into empty fields. There was nothing, no house, no building, nothing but the straight road going across and ending at the stream. Now what was here, she wondered, what was here and is gone, or what was going to be here and never came? Right? That's archaeological sites. That's ruins that are hopes and dreams that have been abandoned because either the people died, the economics changed, right? But that we look for something to get the answer of what was once there before something new comes and replaces it. Eleanor finds a country restaurant, which itself Shirley says, is advertised as an old mill. So in this story, everything has a history. And in archaeology, everything has a history. And that is part of creating the ambiance, that flavor that creates either a haunted place or not a haunted place. In Hillsdale, Eleanor asks, "There are no old houses around here, back in the hills?" And the waitress responds, "Nope." And the man responds, "People leave this town. They don't come here," right? So this sense of abandonment is something that archaeologists study all the time. Why is a place abandoned? What happened? That it once was a place that people thrive, and now it is no longer. So all that is our lead up to Eleanor arriving at Hill House, right? There's a lot of this lead up, but a lot of it sets up who she is and what she's searching for, and that she does not care about warnings, right? And this is a standard thing in horror movies, that people have been warned and they don't stop, and they keep, what did Laura Miller say in the introduction? Meddling. They keep going where they shouldn't be, but that people are compelled to go to these places to understand them. So chapter 5 of part 1 has this meticulously described landscape that I won't read to you again. And we want to think about how ghost stories establish such a sense of place, that it is a connection to this Yufu Tuan. How spaces and places differ from each other. One of the descriptions in this section is, "The house was vile. It is diseased. Get away from here at once." But again, Eleanor continues on. So that brings us to part 2, chapter 1, which opens with a description of the house as if it was human and as if it was vengeful. Right? So this is going to connect to Roger Clark's taxonomy of ghosts, and Clark's description as that haunted houses can be considered ghosts themselves, right? So if a house has almost human-like qualities, or does have human-like qualities, then is a house basically a ghost that you could go inside. Shirley says that Hill House came around her in a rush, around Eleanor. She was enshadowed, and the sound of her feet on the wood of the veranda was an outrage of the utter silence, as though it had been a very long time since feet stamped across the boards of Hill House, right? And this is important for archaeology because often people new to archaeology explain that the thrill of archaeology is in holding something not seen for a long time, and that's what draws them to it. So Eleanor is drawn into Hill House because it's been a very long time since feet stamped across the boards of Hill House. There's a detailed description that mirrors what the description was of the outside, where she speaks about all the angles, and the angles in the rooms and the inside of this house are stories in themselves, stories of workers that long ago interacted with that place, the house, in the past. One of the main things about how archaeologists see objects is that when they look at an object, they think about how it was created and who created it, and then how it was used, which might be different from how it was intended to be used, and how it was discarded and how it changed through time. So to see a house and think about the workers who created the house down to the level of the angles within the house, that is a very archaeological way of looking at a physical thing. So here we meet Mrs. Dudley, and Mrs. Dudley sets dinner at 6 p.m. and breakfast at 9 a.m. And she says, "I don't stay after I set out dinner. I leave before the dark comes. There won't be anyone around if you need help." And this establishes the routine of when others are in the home and helps to chart the passage of time. We know how long things have been based on when Mrs. Dudley appears and disappears. And archaeologists are obsessed with finding ways to chart the passage of time, which often has nothing to do with a clock or a calendar in the sense of hours and days, but more in a this happened before this and that happened after that. So that brings us to part 2, chapter 2, and I'm going to stop there because that's where other people arrive and the story picks up and there's lots of stuff going on. But I wanted to get you to this point where you could start reading from part 2 of chapter 2 on yourself and think about the things that I would have pointed out if I was talking you through the entire book. So that's it for today's recording. This is a little long at 25 minutes, but I hope it was useful.